Right, start letting people into the webinar. Welcome to Powerhouse Arena's virtual events. My name is Chris, I'm the events coordinator here, and tonight we are very pleased to be hosting the paperback launch for Make It Scream, Make It Burn by Leslie Jamison. She'll be having a conversation about essays and obsession with Esmé, Weijun, Wang, Andre Perry, Lynn Steger Strong, and Gregory Pardlo. You can buy copies of the book at powerhousebookstores.com. The link is in the event page and posted in the chat. If you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and the panelists will take your questions at the end of the event, and I will introduce them now. Esmé Weijun Wang is a novelist and essayist. She's the author of the New York Times bestselling essay collection, The Collected Schizophrenias. Her debut novel, The Border of Paradise, was called the best book of 2016 by NPR. And born in the Midwest to Taiwanese parents, she lived in San Francisco. Andre Perry is a writer and arts worker. His debut nonfiction book, Some of Us Are Very Hungry Now, was just released recently. He received his MFA from the University of Iowa's nonfiction writing program, and his work has appeared in The Believer, Granta, The Paris Review, Guernica, and other journals. Lynn Steger Strong is the author most recently of the novel Wang. Her fiction and nonfiction has appeared in the New York Times, The Paris Review, New York Magazine, LARB, and elsewhere, and she teaches writing at Catapult and Columbia University. Gregory Pardlo's collection Digest won the 2015 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. Other honors include fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the New York Foundation for the Arts. He is the poetry editor of Virginia Quarterly Review and the director of the MFA program at Rutgers University, Camden. His most recent book is Air Traffic, a memoir and essays. Finally, Leslie Jamison is the author of the New York Times bestsellers, The Recovering and Empathy Exams, and the novel The Gin Closet. She's a contributing writer for New York Times Magazine, and her work has appeared in publications including The Atlantic, Harper's, and the New York Times Book Review. She directs the graduate nonfiction program at Columbia University and lives in Brooklyn with her family. And I'll hand it over now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris, and thank you all of you for being up for talking to me tonight about obsession, which is sort of like talking about everything. And you know, it's so funny to think about what is possible in the Zoom moment because so much feels lost to us or compromised. But I actually think something like this feels exciting that I can bring all of you into the same space and into the same conversation, along with this beautiful tusk of some kind behind me. And thank you all who are here. I was gonna say at the outset, I'm just gonna talk for a few minutes about the book, Make It Scream, Make It Burn, that we're launching the paperback of tonight. It came out a year ago, but mainly I'm gonna say a little bit about obsession. One of the things that the book is about is various forms of obsession and the ways that it shapes our personal lives, the ways it shapes our movements through the world, the ways we create communities around shared obsessions, the ways we turn to obsession when things hurt or our lives feel somehow like impossible to survive. But I would love, one of the things that I've really come to love about Zoom teaching, we were talking about this a little bit before the event got started, is the chat function. And I was gonna say at the outset that people should feel free to use the chat, and I see that my amazing mother broke the ice with the chat, but I would love to hear from anybody who's here. If you want to blow up the chat, when people talk about the 5 love languages, I think that mine is the chat. Thank you, Ryan. So I'm gonna terrifyingly attempt to—
Oh, sorry, Leslie, can I say one thing real quick?
Sure.
I think people have to turn on all panelists and attendees if they want everybody to see in the chat, if they want everybody to see what they're saying. I just noticed because I think it defaults to all panelists.
Oh,
okay.
Perfect. That was very helpful, because in fact, when I said hello to my mother, I only said it to you guys. So hi, Mom. Hi, everyone. Okay, so I am gonna share a few images that start to tell the story of this book. So this book, Make It Scream, Make It Burn, is a collection of essays, and it's divided into 3 sections. The first section is called Longing, the second section is called Looking, and the third section is called Dwelling. And the first section is a set of longer reported pieces about the whale known as the loneliest whale in the world, who I'm going to talk a little bit more about, kids who have past life memories, the strange world of Second Life, whose founder at one point predicted that everything would go online and all of our office buildings would be empty graveyards, which once seemed like a ridiculous thing to talk about and no longer seems ridiculous. The second section is all about art as a form and various artistic forms of obsession. And the third section is in large part about how we try to show up for everyday life, and how sort of a prior or younger version of myself maybe thought about existence or living, primarily residing in these moments of extreme experience, extreme pain, extreme bliss, and how over the years I've sort of come to think about the ways that profundity or meaning live in those small quiet moments that are easier to overlook. So I'm gonna screen share for a sec, and hopefully. Okay, will somebody give me a thumbs up if it seems to be working? Okay, thanks, Andre. Okay, so the first essay in the book is this essay called 52 Blue, that began, the story of 52 Blue began with these scientists working out of Woods Hole who paired up with these audio engineers who were using these like decommissioned Navy hydrophones at a naval base on Whidbey Island near Seattle. And one of the things, after the end of the Cold War, they had initially used these hydrophones to track Soviet subs, but after the end of the Cold War, they started using them to pick up the sounds of the ocean instead. And one of the most unusual sounds they picked up was this whale, who was remarkable for 2 reasons. And one was that he seemed to be a blue whale, but the pitch of his song was far higher than any blue whale who had ever been recorded. That was the first remarkable thing about him. And the second remarkable thing about him was that he was always tracked alone. He was never in a pod. So they published this paper. And from this paper, once the results became public, people became obsessed with this lonely blue whale with the strange song. And he started to be known as the loneliest whale in the world. And here on the left-hand side, you can see when I went to Whidbey Island and interviewed some of the audio engineers who had originally tracked him, they pulled out all these, Joe was the guy I spent the most time with, and he pulled out all these old charts that he had made of the whale's progress through the Pacific. And he also, although he had become a little bit sick of the ways in which this whale had sort of blown up and become known as the loneliest whale in the world. But when I showed up, the first thing he gave me was this set of cookies, all decorated for 52 Blue, as if what I loved about it was actually in that moment, he sort of confessed that even though he had wanted to somehow be above the obsession, the ways that people all over the world had started to become really attuned to this whale and projected all of these fantasies onto the whale, that this guy was like, you know what, he felt a little bit of it too. Once I started to think about the whale and write about the whale, really what I was so interested in was that part of a person that might be a little bit cynical or not immediately jump on board, but would eventually sort of feel that kind of, feel infected a little bit by that collective obsession. And those cookies sort of reminded me of that human capacity. these are, so once I started to spend some time with Joe, which is part of what I like about doing sometimes more reported work, is that you might show up to an interview thinking you know what you want from that subject or what story you're hoping they might tell, but then they always surprise you, right? Or if you're doing your job right, you give them an opportunity to surprise you. And once I started talking to Joe, I realized that he sort of presented this as this straight man who was like, well, people talk about the loneliest whale in the world, but like, all I know is he was like a blue whale with a particular song. But the more I talked to him, the more I realized like Joe actually was a pretty obsessed with like sort of strange facets of the world, and he had all of these fascinations. So at one point he sort of casually was like, oh, you wouldn't be interested in seeing my carnivorous plant collection, would you? And I was like, yes, I would. And these were some of Joe's many, many carnivorous plants. But I love that idea that like beneath every straight man, if you just scratch the surface a little bit, there's like probably a carnivorous plant collection. That seemed to speak to something beautiful and true about human nature as well. These are a few of the people who I ended up talking to over the course of writing this piece, which really became, and part of why I want to talk about it tonight, really became a piece about obsession. It was the story of the whale and tracking the whale, but it was really the story of the various reasons that people had become obsessed with this whale. So you can see the back of Z, who's a tabloid photographer in Poland, who got a massive back tat that was dedicated to this whale. And if you look at it, you can see one part of the tattoo is an actual whale, and the second part of the tattoo underneath, well, second, there are like 8 parts of the tattoo, but the second whale in the tattoo is the sort of ghostly outline of another whale. And to him, the actual whale and the ghostly outline of the whale represented sort of like whale and projected fantasy whale. And he wanted to honor both parts of this like mysterious mythic creature moving through the sea. The middle piece is a sculpture by an artist named Aurora Robinson, who works with discarded basically litter and collected from the ocean. And she made this whale sculpture out of all objects that have been salvaged from the sea. And for her, the whale was sort of part of what he represented to her was a sort of discarded object that she and others had found a certain kind of beauty in, which was part of how she understood her art practice as well. And then the image on the far right is a painting by a woman named Leonora, who really became one of the primary subjects of the piece. So the essay, in a lot of ways, is a catalog of the obsessed, a catalog of people who became obsessed with the whale. And Leonora was a woman who discovered the whale while she was recovering from a 6-week coma during her period of hospitalization. And really the whale represented for her a way of identifying with a figure who seemed to exist outside of the rules and structures that other creatures were able to inhabit, which was very much how she felt as well. And this was a sort of an imagined moment of her and the whale swimming together. And to me, in the context of her story, there was something so profoundly moving about the way that her particular condition of aloneness had found its echo or its counterpart, or a story that it needed to believe about the world in this whale. And during the end of, we got to know each other for a period of a few months. And at the end of those, she had an art exhibition where she displayed this painting. So it always lives as, when I picture the whale in my mind, I picture Leonora's whale, I picture this whale. And these last few whale images are from a reading that I did, because there was a sort of as I was writing the piece, I was encountering these people who had become obsessed with the whale. But part of what I was interested in talking about tonight was the way that sometimes after a piece comes out into the world, it can perpetuate the very obsessions it was trying to document. And so these images are from one public reading I did of this piece that was in a little shack set up, constructed in a community garden in Bed-Stuy. And a sculptor down in North Carolina had read the essay and created this sculpture of a whale inspired by it or based on it. And again, kind of like Z's back tat, there's the actual body of the whale, and then the yarn draping over the body sort of represents the whale that other people come to believe in, or sort of the meaning, the whale made of the meanings that people project onto it. And then the last few images that I'm going to share are from another essay in the book that felt like, when I wanted to talk about obsession, I thought, well, I'll talk about the loneliest whale in the world, and then I'll talk about Annie. And Annie Appella is a photographer. One of the essays in the book, Maximum Exposure, is really a profile of a particular project that Annie worked on for many years, is still working on in certain ways. But she started to photograph, she lives in Los Angeles, and started to photograph a family down in Baja California in Mexico, and essentially decided she was gonna make it a durational art project where she photographed them for a decade, and then just couldn't stop. So, and I know Greg was kind enough to read some very early drafts of this piece, and so he's known that I've been sort of obsessed with Annie's obsession for a long time. But I found this project, so she kept photographing them. She photographed this family for a decade, then she photographed them for another 10 years, then another 10 years. At this point, she's been photographing them for almost 30 years. And what that means is not just that there's this like sort of incredible transcription of decades in a family's life, but also that in her practice, I feel like there's this really powerful vision of what it means to crave an impossible level of completion. And that's maybe part of what I want to talk about tonight, like that craving to document another person fully, or to document a particular kind of emotional state fully, and how that very impossibility kind of compels us to keep going and keep going and keep going. So these are a few of her images, and in the one on the left, you can see Maria, one of her subjects, with her daughter Carmelita, right at the beginning of Annie's work on this project in the mid-90s. And, you know, of course, by the end now, Carmelita is a grown woman and a mother with a son of her own. And that kind of life trajectory is part of what you can see when you photograph for 30 years. These are a few more of her images, and one of Annie herself. And yeah, I love that shot of her because it kind of captures something about that desire to know or to document. And I thought I would just start us off by reading a couple paragraphs from that essay about Annie, because there are also paragraphs about obsession itself and obsession and creative work, the relationship between the two, and then we'll start talking. I have spent much of my life as a writer chasing poet C.D. Wright's suggestion that we try to see people, quote, as they elect to be seen in their larger selves. But it's an impossible dream. Making art about other people always means seeing them as you see them, rather than mirroring the way they would elect to be seen. And yet I feel defensive of Annie. In the face of the ways others might dismiss her obsessiveness as pathology or excess, I felt protective of her relentless drive toward connection and her compulsion to make herself vulnerable, to communicate fully, to say everything, to document everything, to capture every nuance, every complexity. At a certain point, I started to suspect that my ongoing obsession with Annie's obsession stemmed partially from a savior complex of my own. My attempt to defend an outsider artist who was almost stubbornly uncool in her methods and her affect, who was gloriously unrestrained and sentimental, who didn't apologize for being earnest. Sometimes the relationship between artist and subject can get messy and overwhelming. James Agee knew it, and so did Annie, and so do I. Annie's impulse to keep expanding her project plays out a certain fantasy I felt in my own work. To put no boundaries around my evocation of my subjects, to make them infinite, to let them keep going forever. Representing people always involves reducing them, and calling a project done involves making an uneasy truth without reduction. But some part of me rails against that compression. Some part of me wants to keep saying, there's more, there's more, there's more. It's why I often write 10,000 more words than I was assigned. If any of my editors are here, they can attest that that is the truth. It's back to the Borges problem. In order to do justice to the world, the map has to reproduce the world in its entirety. But does more of a thing always make it truer? If the average length of a photographic exposure is 1/60th of a second, that means Annie has cumulatively captured only about 6 minutes of her subjects' lives. But the force of Annie's work isn't the achievement of a complete gaze, it's the yearning for completion. Her work succeeds most fully not as a comprehensive account of a family, but as an account of her longing to know them, as a testimony more broadly to the human desire to witness other people. Annie calls her work a form of love and considers love a form of focused attention. In the academic programs where I've studied and taught, where bromides are kryptonite and emotion is expected to footnote its own presence, it is always risky to use the word love without cautionary quotes. But that's part of why I keep coming back to Annie. There's no room for scare quotes in how she speaks. She owns the heart in her work. It's another kind of transgression. And if Annie's work is fueled by love, then it's a form of love that doesn't blunt or distort her gaze. Her love sharpens her sight. Her work has helped me trust that an enduring emotional investment, even in all its mess and mistakes, because of its mess and mistakes, can help you see more acutely. It can sensitize your gaze to the competing vectors of emotion churning beneath ordinary moments. The particular angle of a woman's body over her laundry, a father's bewilderment as he stares down at his crying daughter, the posture of a man at the doorway of his new home, grinning as he holds his tired son right before carrying him across the threshold. When I look at Annie's early proof sheets from her first visits to Baja, I see some version of what she saw then. A mother with her infant, a father with his encyclopedias and his tequila bottles and his towering stacks of bricks. But I also see the long shadows cast by everything that hasn't happened yet. Years of day jobs and rejected grant applications and ruptured love affairs, fights with mothers and unexpected pregnancies, addictions and fires and bus rides to new lives. I see the lurking horizons of a project that would keep leaving Annie humbled, more confused than when she'd begun. After 9 years, she said, I understand nothing. In those early negatives, I see cornflakes and cigarettes and stubborn wind and sudden laughter. I see everything the photos knew alongside everything they didn't know yet. And this unknowing is one more definition of love. Committing to a story you can't fully imagine when it begins. And so I thought, thinking about the whale as a case study in obsession and Annie's project as a case study in obsession, I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about how obsession and meaning making are connected, how obsession and art making are connected, and maybe as a way that each of you could kind of introduce yourselves before we start talking. I'd love to hear each of you describe a project. I mean, in some ways, all making comes from obsession, but I'd love to hear each of you describe a project, an essay, a poem, a book that felt like it emerged from a particularly acute state of obsession, took over your life with a particular kind of force, so that's kind of felt like it was starting to seep into everything. To just talk a little bit about what that was like. And I guess I didn't come up with an order in mind, so maybe somebody could save me and jump in. We'll go from there.
Okay, I'll go first.
Yeah.
So actually the first project that came to mind is not a literary project. It was a project that was a visual arts project, because I was actually known as a visual artist for a long time before I was known as a writer. And when I think about that early project, though, I think it has a lot of the early DNA that my later literary projects ended up having. I became really obsessed with the idea of looking at my leftovers. So like what was left over on the plate after I finished a meal. And so I would always carry with me the equipment to draw everything that was left on my plate when I was done eating. And the thing that I realized every single time I drew what was left over is that, especially if you draw really close up what you are done, what is left over when you are done, is that it no longer looks like food. It's very abstract and it's very curious. There are mountains and crags and valleys, and there are strange holes. And it was this big project that I became really preoccupied with doing. And I didn't have a real sense of when I wanted to stop doing this. It just was something that I was really interested in because I was always eating different things and I was always really curious to know what was going to end up on my page after I was done documenting my leftovers. And I think that I ended up carrying that over when I did finally stop. I think it just, the project just kind of came to its natural end course, but I think it taught me something about looking at things very closely and taking this kind of macro view of things. But yeah, I think my early days of obsession and spending a lot of time with visual artists really gave me a sense of obsession, because I think visual artists in particular are really deeply into obsessions. Like I remember this artist I knew who was really into fishing lures, and she she spent years and years and years just painting fishing lures. But anyway, so that is the story that I thought of.
I love that. And I also, I mean, it strikes me that, and I would love when we start talking to hear a little bit more about how you feel like that the leftover project is a kind of way to think about your work since, or how it feels connected. But it also kind of literalizes this aspect of obsession, that it's like maybe that what defines obsession is like the thing you're never away from, or the thing you never get respite from. And it's like if you're doing a project that involves like every single meal, it's just with you, there's like there's no leaving the project behind in this really literal way.
I can jump in. So I have a bunch of different thoughts, and I've been trying to figure out how to make sense, how to make order out of the chaos. And I think that has a lot to do with obsession. There was one particular long poem in Digest that I worked on for about 5 years, and it was about Louis Althusser. And anyone doesn't know, Louis Althusser sort of accidentally, from his perspective, killed his wife, strangled his wife while giving her a massage. And as a structuralist, he's a structuralist, that is, and I began wondering, how does a structuralist, someone who believes that so much of what we do and the ways we process our experience is rooted in language, how does a structuralist manage ethical questions? I mean, and this very obvious ethical question. And for a long time, the poem was just spinning around, and there was no real traction, and I couldn't figure out why I was so obsessed with it. But I think, and as I was thinking about your question, Leslie, I started it became more clear to me that my sense of obsession is connected to a sense of faith, right? And so there's a very practical faith in the determination belief that the longer I pursue this thing, this idea, at some point, all of that chaos is going to, out of all that chaos, some pattern is going to reveal itself, right? And so I just have to believe that if I keep at it, at some point it's going to start to make sense, or show me how to begin to make sense out of it. So I think for me, that's the kind of faith in the writing, the process, but also a faith in the metaphysics, right? Is this where's these kind of, the ethical question of Althusser, first of all, but also it's funny you brought up C. Wright and her idea that we are obsessively trying to capture an individual as a whole being. And I think in some ways, I'm interested, at least right now, in an inverse project, in that I am trying to, in thinking about the whale and past life experiences, I'm very much interested in capturing the projection itself, right? So rather than trying to render an individual, I've been pursuing projections. I'll tell you really quickly. So the project that I'm working on now, I'm interested in, well, it led me to witches. The police officer, Darren Wilson from Ferguson, who shot Michael Brown, I noticed in his deposition, he said that Mike Brown had, I'm paraphrasing, had risen up like a demon before me. And I started thinking about all the rationalizations for these extrajudicial killings being, well, I feared for my life. And we all say, well, yeah, sure, that makes sense. I got it. Okay, it was justified. And in some way that reduces our legal system, our judicial system, to a system of processing the fears. And I think Claudia Rankine has very famously said this, right? It's, Black men are dying because of white men can't control their fears, talking about police in particular. And so I've been interested in the projection. Can I hunt down that projection? And that projection being very much symmetrical to witch hunting, right? And that whole phenomenon. So I'm kind of going into this kind of metaphysical realm with my obsession.
Yeah, I mean, so much to say about all the parts of that, but I think first of all, what you were saying about faith and the kind of that part of obsession is this faith that if you keep going into that chaos or kind of accumulating more and more of it, that it will resolve itself or reveal some kind of meaning. And I think it's an interesting kind of faith. I think I too feel that, and certainly have an intense relationship to excess, which I would love to talk about how sort of excess, or how you guys relate to the idea of making more of something as a feature of obsession. But that, I think for me, it's like kind of a panicked faith. Like it's as much panic as it is faith. It's as much the panic of like, maybe I don't know exactly what this means, but if I make more of it, or if I like keep fumbling towards some kind of accumulation of mass, that like something will come. Like there's a panic in it, and the way in which panic creates action, or fear creates action, feels connected also to the second part of what you were saying, this way that the infinitude of fear, the sort of cover of fear, or the alibi of fear, comes to, it's like an emotional reality that gets to kind of assert its realness in a way that when you were saying like I'm less interested maybe in documenting the infinitude of an individual and more interested in documenting the infinitude of projections. I was thinking about the ways in which sort of emotional lives of others I sometimes treat as this holy grail when I write, but they're actually completely toxic, violent forces as well, those emotional interiorities. So I don't know, thinking about all of that.
I feel like a lot of what Gregory said makes sense to me, especially the sort of way that as you were talking, I kept thinking about chaos, but also I want to add maybe to faith something that I'm obsessed with, which is connected to all obsessions, is this process of containment. That then if you can contain a feeling or an idea, which is it's interesting. And it's interesting, I keep thinking, well, is it because I'm a fiction writer that I'm feeling this way? But I feel like it's opposite in some ways, in terms of like, I come at it from an obsession of a feeling that is in my body that I feel like I can't get out, right? And this feeling that like I can't get out because there's no process of containment that will make it possible to offer to somebody else, which is what in some ways I think of as art, right? It's just this idea of like containing an idea or an individual or something such that you can give it, right? And so I think like, for me, it's always this sort of teeth clenching, bodily feeling that there is a thing inside of me and there is not language sufficient to offer it. And then the process is always a process of finding the proper language, and within that language, and it made me think when I was looking at your book earlier today, Leslie, like how objects to me come second, right? That like the idea or the feeling comes, and then it's a matter of like finding the objects that can accrue to sort of build and establish toward a representation of this feeling that feels ineffable or impossible. And you know, I think, because I don't think I answered your question, and I'll do it really fast. The most recent one, and I named a book Want, I think because I was obsessed with want, but then that's impossible, right? Like I think too, it's one of those words that means absolutely nothing. It's like elastic and floppy. And if you ask people what want means, they would all say different things. And I think, like, to me, as I was sort of churning into that space and trying to contain it, it was about shame, and it was about desire, and it was about lack, and it was about, so it was this way that the feelings I'm most interested in portraying are feelings that feel like no word will do it right. So then I need objects and images and the accrual of all of them. And again, I think it's that idea of like, which again, I'm so interested, like, because this infinitude, it's almost like the opposite. Like I'm always like, I want to siphon everything off and get it tight so I can give it, and I feel like, but I know you well enough to know we have very similar interests, so it's interesting to think about. I would never get out of bed if I had to think about containing a whole person, because I know I can't. I know I never could.
I know. How did I get out of bed? how do I get out of bed?
Because you're stronger than me.
Yeah, no, but I love, and I think that, and I think that question of containment and obsession is at the core too, because it's like, for any creative project, it's like the momentum to want to do it has to come from some kind of obsessive place, I think, but then that obsession has to meet edges of some kind in order to become anything. And so then the question of creating or finding those edges is a question of containment or form or structure, or, for the sake of the editor or the reader, or just human possibility, like to make it not the 80,000 word essay that was commissioned at 3,000 words, but instead something, and really gets to that, for the part of the essay I read where I talked about like, is more always truer. I think that some part of me, again, that is a little bit fear driven, thinks more and more and more will always create more and more and more truth. But I think what you're saying about containment is like, actually doesn't work that way. Sometimes the one well-chosen detail does so much more than 20 details all sort of piled on top of each other. The one metaphor, I remember in workshop when I was in grad school, it was like, we always would get I would turn in sentences with 6 different similes. Like it felt like a roller coaster and a water slide and it was just because I couldn't actually figure out what the fuck I was saying. So, so that way that containers or sort of whittling or decision making pushes back against the obsession or the quest for it, the kind of hunger for the infinite, or the idea that more is always truer. I think that tension is like where so much of the process lives.
I can jump in there, I guess. I'm just like
we're all staring at your square, Andre.
I'm just like bathing in everyone's like knowledge here, and so I'm like, actually, I just want to like listen to this conversation, but I'll say some things. I think in this current era for me, I'm just like so deeply obsessed and drawn to and trying to figure out like all of the threads that make America what it is. And I think it's really the world what it is, but I think I use America as like my focus point, since that's what I'm most familiar with and that's what I have access to. And I think it's really just trying to figure out what are the American dreams, or what are the projections of America that we put out there as like the full body of America as we put out there through propaganda, as we put out there through the news, through our actions, and like what is the distance between that dream and like the actual reality of what's happening or what has been happening. I know it seems so like basic and like so it like should be so easy to understand, and like having grown up here and like studied history and all these things, I feel like I should know, but I feel like I don't know, or that the truth is just like so flooring and so like jacked up that it's like going to take the rest of my life just to come to terms with it. And I feel I'm trying to peel away all those layers and all of the work I do. You know, I'm a writer. I also like produce festivals and like I'm an arts worker, work at an arts organization, teach. And I'm just like, I think I'm coming at it from each angle, whether it's the subjects and the writing that I'm doing, but also as like, I'm in the middle of like producing a festival right now with my collaborators. And I'm like trying to create platforms for other people to expose what is American history, what is the current moment in America, and where might we go if this is how like both ugly and like still seemingly so like beautiful that it is. I don't know. I guess I'll just stop there. But like that's what's driving me, and I'm even getting like fired up talking about. So I'll just go back.
I only want to get you more fired up though. Well, I was just gonna ask you like what you're putting together, like what kinds of things people are up to who are going to be part of it, because it also does feel like kind of one way of acting on obsession has to do with somehow like multiplicity of voices or perspectives. Like I guess I was thinking about the whale essay, like where it's like somehow the only way to get at this whale involved bringing like 15 people into the frame because I couldn't say it myself somehow. And it feels like so much of what you do as an artist is like your own work, but then it's like the art of curation and gathering and community building, which feels also committed to that faith, and like the truth of 16 voices is a sort of different degree of infinitude than the truth of one, which is all a long way of saying what's going to happen at your festival.
So much. I'll be brief. So we work on this one event called Witching Hour, which is a festival that's multidisciplinary, brings artists together, brings like scientists together, writers, and just like citizens at large who are just like thinking about the world. And we're editing it right now because it's going to be a virtual festival this year since we're not getting together like we usually do. And, part of the conversation is a multi-layered essay from the writer Tamika Conley, who's just one of our best writers, I think, in the country. And she's like exploring the intersectionality of like death through COVID in America, the failure to contain or address COVID, the failure to address justice in America, particularly for Black and Indigenous Americans, and the failure of medicine and life, I think, particularly for Black women, and how just we try to deal with medical trauma when it happens. And she presents that as an essay. And meanwhile, we've got musicians who are coming from different angles about the environment and the work that they're doing. And meanwhile, we've got a politician who's coming who always has to, mince the words or, carefully, he's so careful about the words. He's presenting an essay where it's like, I think the first time that he's expressed what he feels about Black liberation, what he in the Midwest, like in this like kind of like seemingly like white territory. And so it's like all these conversations at once that we're trying to curate to like make sense, but we can't make sense of it, but we can have a spiritual feeling from it, if that makes sense.
That's like such a great mission statement for art, right? We can't make sense of it, but we can have a spiritual feeling from it. Like if only one thing I ever make could manage that. Yeah, I mean, and I was thinking as you were talking about ways in which you're sort of bringing together these people who are generatively operating to make art from obsessions with these kind of long-standing, I mean, among other things, these long-standing injustices that, and I think this connects to what Greg was saying earlier, like the ways in which obsession, like sometimes you can talk about obsession in an artistic context, it's easy to conflate it with the long arc of the moral universe towards justice or something, that obsession is an engine of making, and that there's something inherently beautiful or something, an obsession that bends towards beauty, but obsession is actually also often quite toxic. Like the obsessions we have with all kinds of things, with like completely unrealistic, pretty blind visions of America or what America has been, like that creates obsessions. Fear becomes a sort of obsessive impulse under which, like, you know, to get back to some of what Greg was talking about, like under which all kinds of terrible things happen. And I guess I was curious to hear you guys speak a little bit about, and I saw this question come up in the chat as well, or somebody raised this. A lot of people have been saying a lot of really interesting things in the chat, but one of them was, a couple of them actually, I think, have gotten to this idea of like, what's the difference between generative obsession and like really toxic or destructive obsession, or sort of like when does obsession verge from one of those to the other? And I'd love to hear you guys talk about that in the context of your own creative practice. Like, when does obsession feel good, or like it's helping you make something, and when does it feel like, or start to feel like it's getting in the way? And I would also say, you know, people have started to put up some questions, but put up lots and lots of questions, because we would love to hear from you and to answer them. But yeah, kind of like, what's the difference between good obsession and bad obsession? Maybe what I was using a lot of words to get at.
I'll answer because I was laughing, and I will just say that I'm laughing because my husband is over there, and I'm thinking about how his idea of bad obsession and my children's idea of bad obsession versus my idea of bad obsession are vastly different, because I'm not sure I have a good relationship with obsession, and think most of the time I should be with my obsession, often to the detriment of my husband and family. And I think, you know, you're talking about, you know, fear is one thing, because I think there are obsessions that are paralyzing and there are obsessions that are generative, right? And I think the obsessions, sometimes to me, the obsessions that are generative push me out of a state of paralysis, right? So it's like I'm in the state of sort of obsessiveness, and it's not going anywhere, and it hurts. But if I can transform that, it's the same energy, but I'm taking the energy into a different space, and it's generative. And I think if obsession feels generative, that's where, again, probably my family would say it gets unhealthy, because once it feels generative, it is really all I want to do. Especially I think when it's that early process of containment. Like, I think until I've found the container and I've gotten to the end, it really is like all I can think about. So I often have to get up at 3 a.m. and stay up very late and just keep doing that until I've gotten to the end, so that I can like remember to make breakfast for my kids. They eat. They're very well fed. Leslie can attest to this. They're nice children who I'm nice to. But again, back to, I think generally bad obsession is paralyzing. Good obsession is generative, but also good obsession is, for me, deeply addictive. And I had a woman who was once a professional person who we parted ways, and one of the reasons we parted ways is because she asked me if any of my characters or I could get a hobby. And I said, no, that's no. I physically don't know how to dabble. You know, like I can only sort of dig deep or just not engage. Yeah, that's why I was laughing.
I think that's, I'm interested, it opens, I mean, you've opened 1,000 questions for me, but one of them is definitely like, maybe it's one way of getting at obsession. Like, what is the opposite of obsession? Like, is dabbling the opposite of obsession? Like, how can we define a thing through its opposite? As a fellow non-dabbler, I underline that question.
I was just going to add, I think there's one kind of inflection point is integrity, and I go back to the kind of logic of recovery, right? If I am deeply engaged in a thing, and I have to keep checking myself to see, sort of rigorously interrogating myself as to whether or not I'm being honest about my ambition and my interest, or if it's a distraction, if it is sort of continual, spinning wheel, then obviously it's bad. But but as long as there's a sense of interrogation and I guess the traction of fear that you were talking about, this kind of panic, I think that it feels productive, that I will, and again, back to the faith, as long as I'm doing it in a way that makes me feel, so makes my mind feel vibrant, then I have to have faith that it's going to pay off at some point.
Yeah, just on that, and thinking also connecting it to what Lynn was saying about like paralyzing versus somehow paralyzing obsession versus obsession that feels like it yields some sort of motion. I mean, I guess one of the things that to me feels like the heart of the experiential difference between like generative obsession and bad obsession is whether it's like that kind of, whether it feels like retracing the same territory and that kind of looping anxiety, reiterative, like fighting, having the same argument with the imaginary defense counsel in my mind versus like, obsession that somehow feels like it's, breaking through the doorway into the next room, or like there's something that feels changing about it, or like it's like a computer game where I'm like reaching a new screen rather than just like butting up against the edge of, I'm now doing the thing that I said my workshop teachers always called me out for being like, it's kind of like this and also like this and also like this other thing. But yeah, that like, it's kind of like when I edit, and I was curious how you guys think about obsession in the revision process too, because no part of my process feels more implicated in obsession than revision probably, but sometimes I know it's time to put something down when I find myself inserting a comma where I know that I took it out. I can remember taking it out 2 days before. It's that feeling of like I'm literally in the same room of the computer game that I've been in for months.
I also,
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
just really quick, sorry. I was also thinking about the difference between interrogating and proving. If I feel like I'm trying to prove something, then I'm usually on the bad track.
Mm.
I have certain obsessions that I come to in different ways. And I feel like as someone who writes both fiction and nonfiction pretty regularly, there are different ways that I end up coming to those obsessions. Like I would say that mental illness is an obsession that I come to pretty regularly in both fiction and nonfiction. But for example, in the collected schizophrenias, all of the essays I've written about mental illness, I want to look at obsessively, but from different facets. Like I always want to be asking different questions and looking at it from different points of view or different avenues. Whereas when I'm writing about it in a fictional sense, if I'm going to be asking, say, like a thematic question and addressing that obsession of writing about psychosis, which is one of my obsessions, because I find it really interesting to try to write about psychosis in a very visceral way. I don't want to be asking the same thematic question over and over again and retreading the same thematic question. Like there was a period of time in my life where I was really obsessed with the thematic question of, is there ever a time where it is moral or ethical to support someone who is depressed in killing themselves? And so I found myself coming back to this over and over again, but it wasn't generative in, I felt like, a creative and new way. I just kept writing the same stories about it. And I eventually just decided I had that one story, and it was going to be the closest that I was ever going to get to addressing that particular thematic question. And then I left it alone. And I don't think I've written the story that has kind of satisfied my own kind of creative curiosity about that particular thematic question about that particular aspect of my obsession with writing about mental illness. But I think that was one example of kind of hyper-focusing on one aspect of my larger obsession, and then realizing that I was doing what you were saying, Leslie, about like going around and around in the track and just like digging myself a moat and finding myself like at the bottom with the alligators.
I had one of my, what you said about the moat made me think about a brilliant presentation that I saw from one of my students last week. I'm having my students in my workshop this semester do these what we're calling digital studio visits, where they essentially take the rest of us into their computer for 10 or 15 minutes and show us some aspect of their process. So choose some artifacts from inside, thinking about the computer as a kind of studio space, and choosing some artifacts from that studio space to share with us. But one of my students started out by showing this old black and white photograph of a big hole in the ground with some caution tape around it, and said, this is where my process begins, is like falling into the hole. And one of the questions was, when and how do you come out? And that was a question she didn't have an answer to, which I was like, oh, you're probably gonna make it as a writer. Like, that's, you seem destined for this work. But yeah, I mean, I think what you were saying too, Esmé, about like thinking about these thematic obsessions, and that part of what can feel blocking about them is the idea of sort of telling the definitive story or writing the definitive reckoning with a given question or a given idea, and how that is one way of many ways that the sort of perfect can be not just the enemy of the good, but the enemy of anything existing at all, or the enemy of motion. And because I think the number one reason that I ever feel blocked when I sit down to write, whether it's the scale of a sentence or anything larger than that, is like the perfect version of the thing that exists always inchoate and slightly beyond my vision in my mind gets in the way of producing what will necessarily be the kind of compromised, imperfect version of the thing that comes out. And yeah, in that way, the sort of obsession with saying the thing right can either sometimes be this like carrot that we're chasing, or this thing that keeps getting in the way if it makes us scared to say we somehow have to make peace with saying the sort of imperfect or partial version of it instead.
Go
Go ahead. Oh, no, you go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, I feel like that connects to Greg's earlier point in terms of like, one way that maybe I trick myself into getting out of that moment is saying that actually I don't want to land, like I don't want a hard landing, right? Because then it's that assertion and not that interrogation. So then it's sort of like, if I pressed into new questions, right? Like if I started with questions, then I pressed into new questions. In some ways that feels more doable, and also maybe what writing is more capable of than like if I try to say, no, I'm going to assert or argue, then I get terrified because I don't even know if I believe in that, right? But like, I don't know. I feel like it's connected to that point that Greg made. Like the assertion can be paralyzing, but the interrogation can be like exciting and feel like opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. I feel like interrogation in the world of creative writing has like a much better rep than it does anywhere else. Like nowhere else is like interrogation, the kind of like fun, generative space we want to live in. I cannot believe that it's already the time that it is. There have just been a few questions, and some people are putting some questions in the chat too. So maybe we'll just take a couple of them, and people who have something to say can say it. Because there are some great ones. So one is from my dear friend Colleen, who I know many of you know as well. Colleen says, obsession often results in creative excess. Do you have tricks about how you deal with the sheer volume of material that you create or gather, which, you know, connects to that idea of like the sort of faith, what Greg was talking about the faith that something might emerge from the chaos, or the question of whether more is always more truth, or when and how like less can be more instead. But if so, how do we get to the less from the tyranny of the more?
I'll share a way that I think about I guess just my process, and that is, you know, this essay, the George Simmel essay, the Metropolis and Mental Life, I think. Anyway, I was thinking about that. He's basically saying that the rural mind thinks in one particular way and the urban mind thinks another way. And sort of extrapolating that, I started to think, look at my work as an LA, and this is just in my mind, it has no basis in the actual world, a Los Angeles kind of process of accretion and sprawl versus a New York version process that is vertical and is characterized by compression and polyvocality. And so I try and maintain a kind of dynamics between the two, so that I'm not, you know, just continually adding on, but I am thinking in terms of depth and dimension at the same time.
Yeah, I think about that. First of all, I always love to hear LA implicated in a metaphor in which it has a role to play as well. It's often just like the benighted metropolis in all of our metaphoric configurations or apocalypse films. But I think sometimes I think about some version of that process as like the accordion vision of drafting and revision, where it's like essay, like a draft can get really big when I let myself follow every association or every connection, or, you know, write an idea 16 different times because, you know, maybe I'm going to find the sharpest possible expression of it just around the next corner. I'm going to get at this nuance that I didn't get at the last 16 times I tried to say it. But I just kind of let myself make it big in that way, like get to the Burbank adjacent neighborhood of the, you know, LA metaphor. And then but I think it's because I trust, and I mean, I'm sure some people would say I over trust a kind of rigorous editor who will swoop in, you know, a couple of drafts later and be quite ruthless with what comes. But I actually don't think that that process could be made more efficient by just, you know, somehow producing right off the bat the whittled version. Like, I think sometimes I do need to say something 16 different times, 16 different ways, so that I can look at the mass that I've assembled and pare and scrub and whittle away the 15 versions that don't belong, or maybe take some like shard of meaning or angle of reflection from each of those 15, and they were all somehow needed to be there, but their replications didn't, or something. But that idea of kind of getting big and then getting ruthless, and when you get ruthless and like whittle it down to the core questions, then you actually know where you need to dig deep and like get big again. And so it's that kind of like getting big and getting small, but they're often really tied to, you know, I think Robert Lowell would talk about like revising from a more depressive state, because there was this kind of very critical gaze that could come in. And I've never been able to do anything creatively useful drafting or revision from a depressive state. But I think that idea that you do actually need to cultivate a different mood or posture of mind to access the self inside who's expansive and believes, and the self inside who can be quite harsh or demanding about what deserves to be there and what doesn't, but sort of drawing on those different almost like creative personalities or something in different stages in the process. And one is maybe game for the obsession, and the other questions that are says, well, is this too much, or when is enough? Finds the point of enoughness. All right, maybe we'll just take one last question and call it a night. I wish I could hold you all hostage and talk to you forever. Maybe in the post-COVID era, such hostage taking will be possible again. This question is from Anna. How do you know you've been obsessing over something for long enough or deeply enough to feel qualified or maybe justified in writing about it at all? Oh, the great question. When do we ever feel qualified or justified in writing about anything? I wonder whether things spring to mind for you guys on that, or whether you ever reach a kind of tipping point of feeling like it's possible to say something.
it never feels entirely like I have authority to say something, you know? And like, I think many people, you know, work often never feels like totally done. But I do think all of us in our own way just kind of find like a natural resting place where you're like, I can get off here. And like, it happens in different ways with different works, whether it takes like 4 years to write something or just a couple months or maybe a couple weeks. But it's just like when you get to one of those rest stops, you're like, cool, like we're just going to let that be. And then I'll start getting back to this other thing that I was working on. So never feel totally like this obsession is done or that I have authority to release the thing into the world or share it with other people. But definitely get to a rest stop from time to time.
I love the rest stop. I love the rest stop metaphor. I feel like in total, all of our metaphors are assembling a kind of road trip across America from one metropolis to another, one kind of metropolis to another. But yeah, I mean, just to echo some of that, what you were saying, Andre, like I too think about doneness never as something that resides in the object and more as something that resides in me. Like, because I think if I thought about the object itself being done, or certainly if I thought about the object being perfect somehow or definitive, I would never feel done. But I can feel done or start to feel done when I think, have I given this whatever I have to give it? You know, when I feel like that state of, it less feels like completion and more feels like exhaustion sometimes, but it's like, that's where doneness can reside, as a sort of like, I've spent myself on this and I don't know if I have anything more to spend, more than when I try to sort of evaluate doneness is like, do I look at this thing and think that it's everything I want it to be? And I think just experientially, that's like a way to finish. But it reminds me of that kind of idea of just like, what is this a place where I can get off, rather than like, is this the like gleaming paradise that I had imagined it could become? And I also totally agree. Like, I never feel a sense of total justification or authority, but I think then somehow the creative task is like how to figure out how to say or make anyway, you know.
I was just going to joke that it's whenever my editor starts bugging me about my deadline. But sometimes it can help to have those external markers, just because like otherwise sometimes I feel like I can just keep going and going and going. I mean, I think I agree with that sense of like inner doneness. Sometimes I do get that, like whether I'm writing fiction or nonfiction, where I'm like, oh yeah, this generally feels kind, like I generally feel like I've said all I can say, or like this is like, I think I've run out of, you know, this is it basically. But sometimes it's just like, no, this is due in like a week and like I need to stop. Yeah.
I feel like too, just to loop it back to the thing you guys just were talking about of like the bigness and then the small, like the compulsion is exhausting, right? And then you get so tired, then you go into this other space of like feeling more control. Or I will say, like, right, like I eventually get worn out, which is why I need a rest stop, which I like that, Andre, very much, right? But like the obsession creates compulsion, which creates this. But then I think I get very tired and I start to hit that register of like control. And that's already kind of a different register. And by the time I'm there, the compulsion has been blunted. And then it's almost just like weaning like, to me, it feels just like weaning yourself off of the project, which Leslie's back to your point of like, it's not about the project. It's about like slowly coming to terms with all of its failures such that you can move on to the next failure. But it is that sort of exhaustive compulsion that goes into another thing. That feels like a thing that I can leave the thing. I said the thing a lot, but sorry.
I think we all know. I think the thing strikes a chord of truth in all of us. That we all nod to the thing. We bow to the thing. Well, I think maybe Chris is going to say a few words to close us out, but I would just say I could happily talking about obsession and states of never being done and ongoingness and taking photos for 30 years instead of 10, tracking the whale forever and ever and ever until it becomes not one tattoo but many. I could talk to all of you for years and years, and I hope that these conversations last for years and years. And just thank you all so much for showing up for this one tonight. And here's to the next one, maybe hopefully someday as bodies in a room again. And thanks everybody who came too.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, that was a perfect way to wrap up. You know, not done, just a pause in the obsession.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is
The obsession.
one of the best virtual events we've ever had, I think. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, all of our panelists. Everyone who asked questions and hung out in the chat. A lot of great thoughts going on there too. If you missed any of the event for any reason or want to revisit it, we'll have it on YouTube soon. And please buy a book by Leslie and all of our panelists.
Bye, everyone. Thanks so much, Chris. Thanks, everybody.